The late 90s was an era where, if you like how cars looked, you were spoiled for choice. The cars were aerodynamically sound enough that they could go through corners incredibly quickly, but they weren't so aerodynamic that they had all these bits and pieces sprouting out everywhere. Compare the 1996 Williams to one from the late 2000s. The evolution of the car is insane. Not only did the tyre rules change in this period, but the aerodynamic arms race kicked into overdrive as the teams looked for any way possible to get back what the FIA was trying to take away. And every single time, they did it. The FIA would claim downforce reductions in a new rule set of around, 30%, but the teams would often make it as little as 10%, because the loopholes were there, and the brains were there. Isn't it awesome that the people building the cars are often smarter than the ones making the rules? But the late 90s was also the changing of the guard in terms of dominance. Williams was sliding backwards, as were Benetton. The two Renault-powered teams were left without engine suppliers through 1998 and 1999 because Renault had withdrawn from Formula 1 at the end of 1997. On top of that, Adrian Newey had left Williams, a little hacked off with how things were going at the team, and the FW19 that won the 1997 championships was the last Williams to do so. As such, Williams effectively went through 1998 and 1999 with modified FW19s, with tuned 1997 engines. Despite that, they still finished third in the Constructors in 1998. 1999 was a bit worse for them though. So this left two new teams to occupy the top spot. I say new, they were returning to the top. Ferrari and McLaren. It was 1976 all over again. But this time, it wasn't Lauda and Hunt, but Schumacher and Hakkinen, as the Michael had worked with Ferrari to improve the car since the 1996 season, and Ferrari was now emerging from its banter period. Ferrari had scored very poorly since 1990, despite having drivers like Prost, Alesi and Mansell at the wheel, which is quite similar to today. You got Raikkonen, Vettel, Alonso, Hamilton, Leclerc, and nothing. But Michael and most of Benetton made Ferrari jump forward in 1997 and into 1998. And in 1997 and 1998, Michael almost won the championship, but on both occasions the season ended with retirement in the deciding race. In 1997, a suspected fault with the car caused him to slow down, and as Jacques Villeneuve fired his way into the hairpin at Jerez, Michael had a moment of head loss, turning into the Williams and damaging it, but crucially took himself and not the Williams out of the race. Villeneuve nursed his car into third place and won the championship. In 1998 though, Ferrari had a much more realistic chance to get Schumacher a then third drivers' championship, as he had a very close battle with Häkkinen's McLaren. Ferrari had started the season on the back foot, but with McLaren's so-called fiddle brake being banned and Goodyear bringing better tyres from Argentina onwards, Ferrari caught up, and it was a fight between Häkkinen and Schumacher at the final round. However, this would once again go badly for the Michael. He stalled his car at the start and under the rules had to take the restart from the back of the grid. Häkkinen led from start to finish as Schumacher retired with a puncture. So 1999 rolls around, attempt number 3. Schumacher was confident in his own abilities, Ferrari were confident in the car and Schumacher's abilities, but even more crucially for the Scuderia, McLaren looked like they built a glass cannon. The ultimate in McLaren glass cannons is the MP420, and one of the go-to cars when it comes to naming such cars through all of Formula 1 history. The other being the Lotus 49, with Lotus often being put as an acronym. Lots of trouble, usually serious. There are probably other cars you can think of and name in the comments, and it might not necessarily be fast as hell cars that are unreliable. You could also lump in cars that were incredibly fast but only when the conditions were right. This year's Red Bull for instance, although only in one driver's hands because of how on edge it is. We romanticise the MP420 a lot because it was used in the 2005 season, which gives it some recency bias given that it was the end of the V10 era, so it had a monster of a Mercedes engine. It also never won the Drivers' or Constructors' Championship, losing out to Renault through lack of reliability and picking up a lot of engine change penalties over the course of that season. As such, Alonso won the Drivers, and Renault the Constructors. But like I say, the MP420 isn't the first time that McLaren built a car that was fast, but had a tendency to let them down. Because in 1999 they brought the MP414. Fast as hell, but quite unreliable. As such, it lost the Constructors' Championship to Ferrari. So when you have a car like the MP413, which was not just a fast car but an absolute looker at the same time, you'd think that McLaren's design team would take a look at the car and go, yeah, this thing was good, but what's wrong with it that we can improve upon? That's what a normal design team would do, but this is the design team of Adrian Newey and Neil Oatley, two men that think outside the box, with think outside the box being Newey's middle name. In fact, he's so outside the box has been chucked in the green bins out the back. The MP4-13 had been quick, but there were a few things that could definitely be improved. Now, speed and aero, it had that in abundance, but reliability was something that the team from Woking would have looked at and felt that something could be worked on there. During the 1998 season, the car retired 7 times, with 5 of those retirements being due to the car breaking down. That being in San Marino, where Hakkinen lost the gearbox, Coulthard popped an engine at Monaco and also had gearbox trouble in Canada. Hakkinen also lost his gearbox at Montreal, and DC lost the engine again at Monza. And that's how great David Coulthard was. He could pop an engine at not just the most intensive of engine circuits, but the least intensive as well. GOAT contendership. Well, I mean, one of them anyway. The old Hockenheim was probably as, if not more, engine intensive. The 2 non-mechanicals, for reference, were when Coulthard spun off at the British Grand Prix and Hakkinen being tipped round at the restart of the Belgian Grand Prix. He was clipped on the left front wheel by Schumacher's Ferrari at the restart and that spun him round. Nothing malicious, just one of those things. And then he got clobbered by Herbert Sauber. So McLaren had some work to do. 5 mechanicals in a season was pretty bad, even for a top team in the 90s. For comparison, Williams had just the 1 major mechanical retirement in 1996, that being when Hill's engine blew up at Monaco, although the wheel bearing issue at Silverstone could be another depending on how you look at things. When you were racing in an era where the top 6 scored 10-6, 4-3, 2-1, things could change in an instant. Just look at 1997. Schumacher and Villeneuve regularly had 10 or 11 points over each other, but lost them through retirements or other reasons. You had to be consistent even back then. Having the fastest car wasn't necessarily enough. So it's quite surprising then to find out that the MP4-14 was only 10% of the original car. The engine was still incredibly powerful. There was not a lot wrong with that, but the car was improved upon almost everywhere with all new parts. For one, it was slightly shorter thanks to a new, shorter gearbox, and the chassis overall allowed for a better use of the space that Newey could package together and maximise the returns in an aerodynamic capacity. The key things that you might notice about the 2 cars is that the rear of the 14 had a couple more aerodynamic deflectors added in front of the rear wheels, and this was something that the team started making more use of after they were banned from putting them low in front of the wheels at the end of 1995. The nose was slightly lower and the barge boards were reprofiled. If you really want to tell them apart, look at the barge boards. The ones on the 14 were considerably taller than the 13s. The Mercedes engine was still powerful, but this time it was lighter, which may or may not have been the result of Mercedes using a beryllium aluminium alloy in the pistons that were later challenged and banned on health grounds. Newey used this and the smaller gearbox to properly reorganise the rear packaging, something he wanted to do on the 13 but time didn't allow him with him joining from Williams. As part of this reorganisation program, Newey moved the oil tank and the hydraulic system, using both as artificial ballast so they didn't have to mess around with it later. Oh, and there was a new rear suspension assembly as well. The front was largely the same. So it went out for some testing. Hakkinen and Coulthard initially felt that something was a bit off, but this might be because the car was using a new composition of tyre that had 4 grooves cut into the front, as opposed to the 3 the previous car had. Goodyear had left the sport at the end of the previous season, but McLaren was using Bridgestone rubber anyway, so it was still the same tyre company they were using. So no need to adapt like Ferrari, Jordan, Williams, Minardi and Tyrrell, now BAR, had to. Hakkinen and Coulthard found that the new car had less chuckability to it, but was still brilliant when driven right on the edge. But over bumps, it wasn't as good as the previous car was. And Ron Dennis actually refused to call it an evolution of the MP4-13. He called it, I just need to check on here, the biggest step forward with the fewest parts carried over. Although I have had to translate that from Ron speak, TM. But any hopes that the MP4-14 would be as reliable as the previous car evaporated pretty quickly at the first round in Melbourne. Hakkinen and Coulthard were as they were in 1998, first and second on the grid, with a whopping 1.3 seconds between Hakkinen and Schumacher. Barrichello took a surprise 4th in his Stewart, which was pretty cool, and the grid was separated by nearly 5 seconds. Ah, the good old days. Genet's Minardi was outside of the 107%, but the FIA allowed him to start because his practice times were sufficiently fast enough. But you might be thinking, well, the McLarens were really fast. How did their hopes evaporate? I'm getting there. When the cars were leaving the pits to go to the grid prior to the formation lap, Hakkinen wasn't going anywhere. At the last possible second, he swapped to the spare car and made the grid just before the pit lane closed. The first start was aborted when the Stewarts caught fire, and then Hakkinen had trouble getting away on the second formation lap, which then caused Schumacher to stall his Ferrari because he was waiting for Mika to get moving again and couldn't get off his grid slot because everybody was rounding him. Confusing, I know. But the worst was over, right? No. because Villeneuve lost his rear wing and crashed, meaning that Häkkönen's 18-second lead to Irvine was wiped out by the safety car being called. When the safety car came in, Häkkinen put his foot down, and nothing happened. Coulthard meanwhile was already out with transmission problems. So the unlikely winner of this Grand Prix was Eddie Irvine, with Schumacher finishing a lap behind him. And I remember getting downstairs early on that Sunday morning and checking CFAX and going, Irvine? Yeah, that happened. But Häkkinen bounced back at the next race in Brazil, winning that Grand Prix from the Michael. Coulthard though, he was out with gearbox problems. But when the European season started, there was some hope because Häkkinen and Coulthard once again locked out the front row for the third race in succession. But in that race, Coulthard lost the race win to Schumacher through traffic and other issues, while Häkkinen dumped his car into the wall at the final corner on lap 17. Schumacher won the race, putting him in the lead of the championship. Ferrari led the constructors. In fact, the top two in the championship were Michael and Eddie. Häkkinen was on pole for the Monaco Grand Prix but fluffed the start and dropped down to third. Schumacher won the race ahead of Irvine for a Ferrari 1-2, but Coulthard didn't finish the race. That bloody gearbox again. But the Spanish Grand Prix was proof that when the MP4 14 wanted to work properly, it was brilliant. Monaco, it had been fast over one lap but not great on the bumps, and not as chuckable on full fuel either. But at Barcelona, it was an incredibly close qualifying session, on par with today's qualifying sessions, which might be due to the sheer amount of testing that the cars did at that place. Häkkinen, Irvine, Coulthard and Schumacher were all separated by less than 0.2 of a second. But in this race, it was Irvine's turn to make a poor getaway and Coulthard jumped him into second place. The McLarens went on to outpace the two Ferraris for the entirety of the Grand Prix and McLaren got a 1-2 finish. Coulthard and Häkkinen didn't exactly destroy Schumacher, it was only like a 4-second gap between DC and the Michael, but it's enough. Another win in Montreal put Häkkinen at the top of the driver's standings by 4 points, but Coulthard finished outside of the top 6 thanks to ignoring red lights at the end of the pit lane and getting a penalty. Schumacher meanwhile dropped points by being the inaugural member of the Wall of Champions, which was an uncharacteristic error for him. And Michael did say afterwards that he usually made one error a season and that would likely have been his only one of 1999. As it was, Häkkinen led the standings, and hopefully the car was going to be, well, fixed somewhat. This was further buoyed with Häkkinen taking second at Manicourt after starting 14th, with Michael in 5th. Actually, thinking about it, Mika probably should have won that race at Manicourt, but he spun, dropping his car on a white line in the wet at the hairpin. As it was, Frentzen won it instead. 4 points dropped. But then came the turning point of the 1999 season, Schumacher's leg break at Silverstone, without which I firmly believe Michael would have won the championship. Coulthard took a McLaren win at Silverstone, but Irvine beat the McLarens in Austria, with Häkkinen behind Coulthard on that occasion. But at the German Grand Prix, Häkkinen suffered a scary crash as he headed towards the stadium section. His tyre blew and he spun off at high speed, smashing into the tyre wall and leaving a lot of people thinking that it could be him and Schumacher done for a portion of the season. Häkkinen climbed out of his car rattled but otherwise okay, and I remember watching that race live on ITV and thinking that he too was injured. 8-year-old me. Sounds like a long time ago. It was a long time ago. 28 years to be exact. Coulthard finished 5th in that race, as it so happens. The McLaren scored a 1-2 at Hungary, which was a bit more indicative of the car's pace with Häkkinen ahead of Coulthard, but that was reversed for the Belgian Grand Prix. So it seemed like now the car was doing what it was supposed to do, but then Häkkinen went and double downshifted at Monza and stuffed himself into the wall at the first chicane, where he was then filmed weeping on the other side of the barrier as the Tifosi went mental. The last 3 rounds of the season should have left it possible for McLaren to take the championship. There was still no notice of when the Michael would be back, and with Irvine and Salo not exactly delivering, it should have been somewhat easier for McLaren. When they left the Italian Grand Prix, McLaren had 108 points in the Constructors' Championship, with Ferrari on 102. In the drivers, Häkkinen was equal with Irvine on points, with both on 60, with Frentzen only 10 points further back. Frentzen in his bright yellow Jordan being the dark horse for the season that year. He'd also just won that race at Monza, as well as winning earlier in the season at Manicourt. The European Grand Prix is a video I've already done in full if you want to go and watch that at a later date. It's the race where a Stewart won, a Prost was second and a Stewart in third, meaning the podium was locked out by teams that were owned by former world champions. Ferrari meanwhile had that absolute clown show of a pit stop for Irvine where it took him, well, God knows how long to have a pit stop because they hadn't got the tyres ready. Hakkinen managed to finish 5th with Irvine in 6th, so yeah, that happened. Coulthard spun off. And DC would retire again in the final 2 rounds at Malaysia and Japan. Crucially though, the Michael had returned, dragged back into a race seat by his bosses. There is the story that Michael never intended to come back given that he couldn't win the championship, so couldn't be bothered, but he came back and helped Eddie to a win in Malaysia. Not only was Ferrari ahead in the standings, Eddie was ahead in the driver's standings by 4 points. So the title showdown went to Suzuka once again. Now there is the stuff surrounding Ferrari's barge boards, but it was all thrown out, and I've done a video on that too if you want to watch that later. But anyway, at the final round of the season, Hakkinen was second on the grid with Michael on pole. All that had to happen was that Michael had to stay ahead of Mika, and if Eddie finished 3rd, then Irvine would be champion. But Mika got ahead at the start and never looked back. Although there is the conspiracy theory that Michael let that happen because Eddie couldn't win the championship before Michael did. If Michael had won the race and Mika had been 2nd, Eddie would have been champion by 2 points, well, assuming he finished 3rd. But Ferrari would end up winning the Constructors' Championship by 4 points because DC's hydraulics had failed. So McLaren managed to get the Drivers' Championship, but they couldn't get the Constructors' Championship. And when you look at the statistics, the car was probably less reliable than the previous one. 8 retirements came through reliability. Both cars dropped in Australia, and then you had further retirements at Brazil, Monaco, France, Silverstone, Germany. Sort of, but that was a Bridgestone problem, not a McLaren one. And Silverstone, if you want to get technical, but either way, the final 2 retirements were at Malaysia and Japan. So I would say there's a guaranteed 26 points there on the table that McLaren lost, and another 20 or so lost for Hakkinen, which with everything else that happened that season would have had Hakkinen and McLaren wrapping things up a bit easier than they otherwise did. That season probably should not have gone to the wire. And as McLaren put it on their own website, 7 wins was good, 5 for Hakkinen and 2 for Coulthard, but it wasn't good enough. The car should have won more, but while it was fast, it was a bit over the place. A glass cannon like the MP420, if maybe a tad less. But while the Mercedes engine was absolutely bomb-proof, not failing in a race once all season, the car had other issues with it. Had McLaren gone a bit too revolutionary as opposed to evolutionary? It seemed that a lot of the issues that came from the car were due to it being a way more complex machine compared to the 13, and nobody expected the car to break down like it did. I think a lot of people expected very much the same as the early part of 1998. The car had been developed quite a lot over the course of the season. McLaren even brought upgrades to Japan, because most teams would often test next season's spec engines and aero ideas at the final race, because the cars were largely stable in rulebook form in those days. McLaren's 8-point lead in the standings after the Nürburgring became a 4-point deficit at the end, because Coulthard's car failed to finish in the final 3 races. And given how fast that car could be when it worked properly, that season should have been wrapped up a lot sooner, constructors and drivers. But there is one thing to consider. While the car had been a little bit unreliable even by 1999 standards, there were still 2 occasions when Mika stuffed it into a wall by himself, so that didn't help. But, well, I know people don't like me saying this, it is what it is. So then, a look at the McLaren MP414, McLaren's glass cannon that should have probably wrapped up 1999 a lot sooner through circumstance and the sheer pace of the car. Like I mentioned, too revolutionary? Let me know down in the comments and get a discussion going. And while scrolling down, if you liked this video and or found it interesting, you can, well, like it so I know I did a good job. And for more stuff like this, you can subscribe and also get that bell on so you never miss out on anything else that I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the mad lads over at Patreon for the continued support. If you want to help with image purchases or otherwise keeping the lights on around here, there's a link to Patreon down in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates and any other bits and pieces you might want or need to know. Well, there's super thanks for any one and done donations, and memberships if you want a Patreon, but without going through Patreon. So until next time, I've been AdmiralLaWind, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.